everyone. As Amber mentioned, I'm Natalie from the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, and we're going to talk about rain gardens today. We're just kind of going to dive in here. So I am one of the instructors for the Northeast Ohio Master Rain Gardener program. I'm their plant expert. I don't know how I got that title, but it's who I am, I guess. I do love plants. So we'll talk a little bit about that later in the presentation. But first, we're going to kind of go over, this is Rain Garden 101. That's what we're kind of going to go over today. So what a rain garden is, what its components are, how we might install one. And then we're kind of going to get into some little details of it, and then we'll talk a little bit about the Master Rain Gardener program, which is actually a 5-week program that you can either then become a Master Rain Gardener volunteer, or you can become certified by installing your own rain garden at your house. So we will get started. The Master Rain Gardener program is a lot of agencies are involved with it. It's mostly a partnership between Chagrin River Watershed Partners, the Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District, and the Cuyahoga Soil and Water Conservation District. This sea of logos down here is kind of ever changing depending on who's participating in any given year. The program that we're currently using was created by Washtenaw County in Michigan, which is in Ann Arbor. And they created this program and it was super, super successful. We've been doing rain garden programs for 15 years here in Lake County, and we just didn't get a lot of participation. But then we learned about this program, and since then we've gotten, in Northeast Ohio, we've gotten over 70 rain gardens installed in 2 years, which is like blows our old numbers out of the water. So it really does seem to be a little bit more helpful to educate people about what rain gardens are through this program. So first we kind of need to know really what is a rain garden. So we're going to talk about what that is, the benefits of it, and all the whole process you would have to follow in order to install one. So here is an overview of what a rain garden looks like. So let's start with the basics. What is this rain garden? As you can see from this diagram, rain gardens are a depressed garden that are designed and located to receive water runoff from impervious surfaces. So that can be from your roof, your driveway, or your lawn. They work with nature to collect, filter, and infiltrate that stormwater runoff. They do this in an aesthetically pleasing way by displaying a variety of colorful and low maintenance native perennials. And they really thrive with those native wetland tolerant plants, but they also need to tolerate dry too. And we'll get into why that is later as well. So why do we really need rain gardens? To understand the benefits of a rain garden and understand why we really need them, especially in urban areas, this is particularly important. We need to understand what stormwater runoff is. So, and the impacts that kind of go along with it. So when stormwater runoff it's any water that it could be from rain, melted snow, or outdoor home usage, like from your hose. And it's water that can run off your washing car, across your driveway, when you water your lawn or your garden, but that water isn't absorbed into the ground. And that water flows over these hard and impervious surfaces like your driveway or the street. And then they end up in storm sewers that then is discharged to nearby bodies of water. And that water is never treated. It goes straight from your driveway or your lawn or your roof into either the storm sewers or into a drainage ditch, creek, and then they end up in streams, rivers, and then ultimately Lake Erie. And that water isn't treated, and it carries with it a lot of pretty icky stuff. Because, see, it's not just water that ends up in there. It also collects debris, chemicals, sediment. People don't know this, but soil or sediment is actually the #1 pollutant in Ohio streams. And all kinds of pollutants, and heat is technically a pollutant too, so it can make our streams too hot, which is a bad thing. So pet waste is another one that can cause to like increases in the nasty bacteria at the beach that cause beaches to be closed. So all of these things, this is why stormwater is a problem. It's all these tiny little things that we're all to blame for stormwater pollution. It's like a death by 1,000 paper cuts is what stormwater is. So stormwater has other impacts too, other than just the pollution aspect of it. So since we've created all of these areas that are these flat surfaces that are impervious, it can lead to higher flows in streams, and that can cause habitat destruction, that causes erosion, increased flooding. And we all know that we don't like it when our backyard floods or our basement floods. That's costly to people, and it's not good for the planet either. So here's a video of what stormwater pollution looks like when it's entering a body of water. So this video is an underwater video that was recorded in 2011 of in Seattle, of a Seattle storm drain that is emptying into the Puget Sound. So you can see the water around it isn't too bad looking, but that water that's coming out of that pipe is pretty grody. And this is stormwater pollution, and this is what it looks like. You can imagine that this isn't good for the things that live there. It's also important to remember that we get our drinking water from these water bodies too. So it's important for us to try and keep it clean. But it happens here too. So this photograph was taken at the mouth of the Grand River a couple years ago in July of 2019. That was that super rainy year where it rained like every single day of May. And this was after a pretty significant storm event. And this is taken from the edge of the fishing pier at Fairport Harbor. And you could see the water leaving the Grand River and entering Lake Erie was this thick chocolate milk color, full of sediment and pollutants. So it happens here too. This is a big problem. In fact, the EPA considers it an enormous threat. It's actually the leading threat to water quality in US surface waters. And this is also a big problem because you might be familiar with harmful algal blooms. Stormwater runoff is one of the contributors to those harmful algal blooms. Sometimes they're large and cover all of Lake Erie, sometimes they're not. It really all depends on how wet of a spring we have and how much it can be fertilizer for people's lawns or golf courses. The major contributors are agricultural, so whether that is runoff from large animal feeding operations, or from fertilizer from farm fields. But the state has ways to kind of manage those. It's a little bit harder and a little bit trickier to manage stormwater at an individual level. So as you can imagine, developed urban areas have more impervious surfaces than natural landscapes. This means an increased amount of stormwater runoff, which means negative impacts to our streams in the surrounding area. So conversely, in a forested watershed, when it rains, water infiltrates and it soaks into the ground and it recharges that groundwater. That's natural. That natural infiltration can't happen when we cover everything in pavement. Here we can see it in the photo of the natural landscapes. That water has a place to go. It's not just funneled away as quickly as possible. We'll talk a little bit more about that in our next slide. So there's kind of two schools of thought in how to deal with this excess runoff. So one of them is gray infrastructure. So gray infrastructure seeks to protect communities from flooding and other health concerns, but it does it by trying to move that water away from buildings and infrastructure as quickly as possible. So think about, buried pipes and concrete and ditches, culverts, those kinds of things. Now, green infrastructure is different. Green infrastructure actually tries to use nature and make it work for us. So this can include things like green roofs, pervious pavement, bioswales, and rainwater harvesting like rain barrels. That's what all these pictures are of things that are trying to mitigate that water. So this picture is taken at the Menor Lagoons. And this whole parking area here with the brick is pervious pavers. They are like brick pavers and they have a gap in between them. Water sinks right into them, so nothing runs off. Next to it is a large rain garden or bioretention cell, and that holds even more water. Here we have a rain barrel. Here we have a residential rain garden, and this is a residence in Mentor that has that rain garden installed. So these green infrastructure practices tend to be more cost effective than gray infrastructure practices. And they kind of have nature, you're not working against nature, you're working with it. So sometimes they can have a large upfront cost, but their maintenance tends to be less. So in today's stormwater management systems, we use a mix of both gray and green, but more and more green practices are being used. So rain gardens are one of those, and it doesn't have to be, rain gardens can be like that big bioretention cell, but those are a little bit more engineered. But in our homes, individual homeowners can use rain gardens, residential rain gardens, to do a lot of good. So they collect local flooding and reduce burdens on the stormwater system. They collect and infiltrate that runoff and reduce that polluted water that reaches our streams, so it stops it from getting in the streams in the first place. Then the plants in the soil that are actually planted in our rain garden, they actually, through biogeochemical processes, can actually break down some of those pollutants, so they don't really exist in their more toxic forms. They slow down, they cool, and they clean the water before it reaches our streams with the groundwater. They can also help manage erosion because they're stopping that big, large amount of flow from reaching our streams. They also can help with puddling and ponding around your house. So some people install a rain garden and that spot that was always wet in their yard isn't wet anymore because the water's in the rain garden. They also, because they tend to be planted with native plants, they are great for pollinators. They can attract birds and butterflies. Rain gardens are usually brimming with life. They have a lot more going on than your lawn. And they can be beautiful too. So they really have a lot going for them. So now you know about the negative impacts of stormwater runoff and why rain gardens are awesome and great. Let's show you how to build one of them. So before I start with the construction of rain garden, so the first thing you want to do is you have to plan where you're going to put your rain garden. So you have to take time and think about where it makes sense to put it, how big it needs to be. So what you need to consider is your water source. So where is that water coming from? So with this picture of this house here, you can see that there's a downspout. They already have a rain barrel on there, which is awesome. But that downspout, so that's where our water is coming from in this situation. Not all downspouts are disconnected. That's something else you may need to think about. So if your downspout is not disconnected, make sure that in your community you are allowed to disconnect your downspout. You may have to apply for a variance to do so in some communities. Although most communities in Lake County, you are allowed to disconnect your downspouts. Remember that water flows downhill. It's very hard to get water to go uphill, so gravity is your friend. You want to consider the amount of space that you have in your yard. You may not realistically have the spot that's closest to your downspout. You may not realistically have enough space to put a rain garden there, and we'll get to kind of why you could put it in certain places later. And do you have any obstacles or hazards in the way? So like, oh, I know I have sprinkler lines there, or oh, that's where my concrete patio is, so I can't put one there. So let's start with that water source though. So your water source could be from that downspout like it was in that last picture, but it could come from other places too. So some roof lines don't have a gutter, so we have to think about, do we need to install one if we want to direct the water to a specific spot? Do we want to maybe do like our lined rock channel to get it there? Our water could potentially run off of our driveway, which in this picture we can see that they would be getting water from both their roof and their driveway. You can also, some people receive water from the street or sidewalks too. Lawn is actually another place too. So some folks, most of their stuff is just sheet flow across their lawn. That's a pretty big issue, particularly here in Northeast Ohio. Also remember that water goes downhill. So rain gardens should be placed downhill of your water source. This would seem to be like very common sense, but it isn't always so cut and dry. So as we can see here, while the downspout in this house is coming out onto this driveway, and you think, oh, well, what if I try to collect that by putting my rain garden in this spot? But the problem is that is uphill. So it's not going to work to put it there. You can also, if you're confused, because maybe your lot's kind of flat, you can always turn on a hose and just see where the water goes. That's another good way to do that. Sometimes the only viable spot to put a rain garden is actually where the water's already ponding in your yard. And that just means that your rain garden kind of decided the spot on its own. Some people like to put their rain garden slightly uphill from that area where they already have standing water. And some folks choose to just plant in the area where the water collects. That's really up to you. So site selection here, space is a really big issue with this one. So one of the big things that we talk about in the Master Rain Gardener program is that we don't want to do any more harm. So we want to do no harm. Just like doctors, as Master Rain Gardeners, we want to do no harm. We don't want to make this any worse than it already is. And by putting a rain garden, something that's meant to collect water, right up against the foundation of a building, we would be causing more harm. That would mean to wet basements, cause all kinds of problems. Foundation damage, those are not things that we want. So it has to be a minimum of 10 feet away from a foundation. So in this picture, people wanted to put a rain garden back here behind their condos. They could not. It was too close to the foundation and too close to some utilities that needed to have access to. So it wouldn't necessarily work there. It also, you don't want to put it right on a fence line with a neighbor that maybe you're not super friendly with. We've had folks that have actually worked with their neighbors and put in like big rain gardens that kind of span across the property line before. But you know, you want to make sure that you're staying a couple feet away from property lines and that you're at least 10 feet away from a foundation. Things can be fudged a little bit if the building is on a slab and doesn't have a basement, but those are things that we talk about in a little bit more depth and on a case-by-case basis. Sun is also something to consider. So you can put a rain garden in pretty much any condition, in full sun, part sun, or shade. You just have to make sure you pick the right plants. And we'll talk about some plants for those different conditions later. Obstacles and hazards. So tree roots are a big one. You might be like, oh, it would be so beautiful to put this rain garden under this tree in my yard. But there are so many tree roots there, and that tree is already doing a lot of work in sucking up this water on its own. We don't want to disturb it and potentially damage the tree. It also makes for very challenging digging. And we haven't talked about all the digging that goes into building a rain garden yet, but you'll see later that it can be pretty extensive. So you don't want to make it any harder than it has to be. So we would say avoid the drip line of a tree. So sidewalks are something to consider as well. There may be a sidewalk in the way between where your water is going and where you want your rain garden to be. Something to consider. Septic fields, don't put a rain garden over your septic field. That would be a bad idea. We don't want to introduce too much water into a system that's kind of designed and engineered a very specific way. If your slope is too steep, if you have to build a retaining wall that's greater than 2 feet, you actually have to call an engineer in to do that. So that would make for a far more complicated rain garden, and it might not be quite right. We have had folks that do tiered ones, like multiple tiered ones, to stay under that 2-foot level, and they have worked well. They've just required a little bit more planning. Also, underground utilities. Always call oops before you dig. So we actually recommend when people are planning their rain gardens to actually call oops before they even plan exactly where they're going to put their rain garden, because they really may have their heart set somewhere and you can't do it because of buried utilities. So then you have to plan your size. So how do you plan the size of your garden? Well, it depends on how much water is actually draining to that area. So to calculate the drainage area, you do this by determining which impervious surfaces will drain into the spot you've chosen for your garden. When it comes to roof, rainwater is sectioned off and distributed into different gutters. As you can see in this picture, the shaded area of the roof represents the impervious area that's draining to a particular downspout. This would be the area that you want to calculate if you wanted to build a rain garden near that side of the house, like is demonstrated there. You don't have to get on top of the roof and physically measure, fortunately. There are several ways that you can do this. You can use Google Maps as a great one, or Lake Navigator is our Lake County's GIS system, that you can see an aerial view of your house, and you can actually draw shapes on it, and it'll calculate the square footage for you. If you have a less complicated roof, you actually can just like calculate the size of your roof and just divide by number of downspouts. That's another simple way to do it. Yeah, once you have that area, we're going to write it down because you're going to use it to figure out your size. So in Cuyahoga County, they use My Place. In Lake County, they have Lake Navigator. And in Geauga County, they have Geauga Real Link. So this is another view of aerial view of determining the area that would drain to a rain garden. There is an additional calculation that you would add to it if you had a lot of lawn also draining to it, but you would keep those calculations separately. So you would have your roof or driveway drainage, and then you would have any lawn drainage if it's more than 30 feet from your downspout, and keep those calculations separate. Then you have to determine, other thing you have to determine size is how well does your soil drain? So you would have to do a percolation test, which just essentially is just seeing how long it takes that soil to absorb that water, and how long it takes that drain down time. So to do this, you dig an 18-inch deep hole and you fill it with water. If it's been super, super, super rainy, you don't have to fill it with water because your soils are already saturated. The point of filling it with water the first time is just to get it's super saturated. Then you're going to fill that hole again, and you're going to start a timer. And you're going to see how long it takes for that to drain. And if your percolation test is less than 24 hours, then your rain garden should be 20% of that drainage area of your roof or driveway drainage. And when you dig it, it'll have to have a final ponding depth of 4 to 6 inches. Now, if your percolation rate is more than 24 hours, then you have poorly draining soils, and your rain garden should be 30% of the drainage area. So it should have a bigger footprint, but it'll be shallower. It'll only be 3 inches deep. This is because if we have poorly draining soils, we're going to need to rely a little bit more on evaporation in order to get that water to some of it's going to infiltrate, some of it's going to be taken up by the plants through transpiration, and some of it's going to evaporate. This is essentially giving us greater surface area for that to happen a little bit more quickly in those poorly draining soils. Now, there is a formula that we run this through. So we multiply them. There's also an additional calculation that you can do for lawn, which is you would multiply it by, I think, like 1.5% or something like that. But let's say you are math averse. This sounds very complicated, and you're just not quite sure about all of that. It's okay. Do what you can. The average rain garden, even with different roofs and amounts of drainage and all that, most of them end up being about the size of a parking space anyway. So, just plan it to be about the size of a parking space, and see what you can do. So let's go over the parts of a rain garden. So one of the elements of the rain garden is the basin. So the basin is this bottom part where the water actually ponds. This is, if we look at another picture here, the basin is like the bathtub. So we're going to refer to a rain garden as a bathtub a few times here. So this is the actual tub part of your bathtub. That's the basin. It should have a fairly flat bottom so that water has a place to pond. There's your basin. Next part, conveyance. So there has to be a way that your water is getting from its source into your rain garden. So there's a lot of different ways that you could do this. For instance, you could create a swale to convey the water. So in this drawing here, they used a swale. This drawing, there's a swale. Some people will line this with rock or even landscape fabric so that water really stays in that channel and doesn't end up out of it. They'll fill it with rocks, or sometimes it's just a grass swale, and that's fine too. Another thing that you can do is you can pipe it to the location it's going to go. So for example, this person here, when they were installing their rain garden, there wasn't enough space where they wanted to install their rain garden. There wasn't enough space. They couldn't be 10 feet away from their foundation and have enough space away from their property line or interfering with trees. You can see there's a lot of trees and bushes in their backyard. So that wasn't going to work. So they actually piped theirs out to a side yard where they did have enough space to do that. So there is another example. The berm. This is another really important part. This is like the sides of your bathtub. This is what's going to hold the water in and prevents that runoff from really going anywhere. This is also a place to, when you're digging this out, you're going to have a lot of soil. And this is a place to deposit a lot of that soil. Usually not all of it, but a lot of it. You don't want your berm to be higher than 2 feet. So like I said before, if you have a really steep slope, it can be pretty challenging to put in a rain garden. But if you have a little bit of a slope and you can, like, some people will even put in like a little brick wall or something like that that's backfilled with soil. And as long as it isn't higher than 2 feet, then you're fine. So that's what a berm looks like. This rain garden in this picture is actually at the house that is on the corner of the street that the main Mentor Public Library is on. So an outlet. This is probably the most forgotten part of a rain garden. And you need to give that water somewhere to go in case we do have an unusually extreme rain event. At the beginning, your rain garden will probably overflow a lot because it's not functioning at full capacity yet. So you need to have that emergency overflow. This is like in our bathtub, that emergency overflow so that your bathtub doesn't overflow. It's exactly what it is. It directs that water to a safe place. So you have to consider where you want your overflow to be. Like, you probably don't want it emptying directly onto a sidewalk or something like that. So directing it to a safe place. So now that we've planned all of those things and got that all figured out, and we know all of our parts of our rain garden, we're going to need to start to dig. So when you plan, you got to think about what the digging is going to be like. So like I already mentioned, you don't want to put this under a tree because that's going to make your digging a lot harder and potentially damage your tree. There are other things that you might want to consider that may make your digging easier or harder. So like if you have to go under a sidewalk, there is a way that you can use a PVC pipe and a hammer and dig a hole on both sides to get your downspout to go under there. Maybe you can just pop a block of sidewalk up and put it underneath if that's the case. So consider that there may be a lot more than just simply digging a hole. Ideally, you would want to do the cut and fill system. So this is a simple diagram of cut and fill. So you start digging on the upward side of the slope, and then you move that soil to the downward side of the slope. So that way you end up with an area that is nice, flat, and level, has a berm on the one side to keep all that water in. So this is ideally what you want. And you want to think about, well, what's the easiest way to do this? It can kind of be a little confusing for those of us who are more spatially challenged. And you say, well, how am I going to make it flat? You're going to use a level. So there's multiple ways to measure this. So one of them is this very simple tool called a string level, or a line level. They cost about $1.50 at the hardware store. You would pound 2 stakes into the ground, and you would make sure that your line is level with your rain garden, and then you see if that line level lines up with it. There are other ways to do this too. When I installed my rain garden at my house, I did this. I put a board across the bottom of it, and I just put a regular old level on there. Another thing that you can do too is if you don't have a level or don't have a line level, wait until it rains and see how the water puddles in there. If it really puddles a lot more to one side than to another, then you know you might need to do a little bit of figuring out there. How deep should your water be? So this depends on the type of soil you have and kind of the space that you have as well. So remember that we said that if your soil is well draining, then you want your ponding depth to be about 6 inches. So that means you're going to have to, your final ponding depth will have to be 6 inches, not including mulch. And if you have poorly draining soils, you want that to be 3 inches. So you don't have to dig it as deep if you have clay soils. But if you have clay soils, your digging will likely be a lot harder. So, but how do I know how deep that is? So it's wherever the bottom of your pipe or your inlet into your rain garden is, that from there down to the bottom of the basin is how you will measure your ponding depth. And while you're doing all this, you may come across some good topsoil on the top, and make sure you set that aside for later. So it's measured from the top of the okay, that looks good. Okay, so you're gonna dig down, let's say you have sandy soil. So you dig down 6 inches from the bottom of your outlet. And you go, oh, look at that, I'm done. I can plant and be done. Sorry, you're not done yet. You have to dig down another 6 inches, so total of 12 inches. Then you're going to add some of that sandy soil back in, and you're gonna mix that with a bunch of compost. So you have to dig, then you have to dig a little bit more, add a little bit back in, and mix it all up. And then you're going to add that compost back in there. Some people add topsoil, add like commercial topsoil that has more organic matter in it too. So you're also going to want to make sure that the bottom is not scraped very smooth, particularly if you have clay soils. So if you have clay soils and you make that bottom super, super slick and smooth, you essentially just created a pond liner, and that water is not going to infiltrate. So you kind of want to scrape that up. So, you know, take that rake, scrape up the bottom. We call that hydrologic discontinuity. And so that really is going to help with your infiltration in the future. What some people do is they will add their compost and their topsoil in, and then they will till it all together. So it really scrapes up the bottom and kind of gets that native soil mixed with that, either the topsoil or the compost. So you have like a really, really nice medium to plant your plants in that's going to hold on to more water than your native soil could on its own. And you're going to do the same thing with sandy soil. Sandy soil, you may need a little bit less compost, or you may need more depending on how nutrient deficient it is. You really can't go wrong with more compost. Then once you get it in there, you're going to kind of want to pack it down a little bit so that you can get it nice and level and even. And that's when you measure it with your level. We would want to move around a little bit more than Pigpen's moving around here, because we would want to get it nice and even across the whole bottom of the rain garden. Then you're going to apply your mulch. The mulch does not count toward ponding depth. So for example, if you have a poorly draining rain garden, your ponding depth should be 3 inches. If you add 2 inches of mulch on top of that, your rain garden will not look like a rain garden, but it still is. There will only look like there's 1 inch of ponding depth, but there will actually be 3 inches, because mulch does not count toward ponding depth. That is a very common misconception. And then you're going to plant it. So how are some ways that we can minimize digging? So let's say you're not as able-bodied as you used to be. Let's say you just had knee surgery and you really want to install a rain garden, and you can only coerce the neighbor kids to do so much for you. So let's think about some ways that we can work smarter, not harder. So one way to do less digging is no pipe, just do overland flow, have it run across the lawn or through a rock channel. You can also use a pop-up at the end. So a pop-up essentially allows us to raise where our ponding depth is. So the water is actually entering at a higher point, so you don't actually have to dig as deep. You could also just add a berm, so you could minimize digging. If you put it on a hill, it's probably the easiest way to do, because you don't have to dig everything out. So if you put it on a little bit of a hill and you just add a berm, that's probably one of the easier ways to do it. And the absolute easiest way to do it is if you already have an area that ponds regularly with 3 inches of water, in it, which many of us have here in Northeast Ohio, you can just strip the sod from that area, add some compost, mulch, and plant. And that's it. Add a berm if you think you need it, and an overflow if you think you need it. So we've had folks do this and their rain gardens work perfectly, and that used to be a part of their lawn that was not functional anymore and was a big pain in the butt. They couldn't mow in it. It was always wet. And now they just have beautiful plants growing there, and it's not an eyesore. So it kind of is easy, and it's kind of a win-win. So once you have done all that, then you plant. But planting, there's a lot of choices to be made, a whole lot of choices. And these are things that are best planned out ahead of time. So we're going to go over some design considerations next. So something to consider is your streetscape sensitivity. So that's critical to design. That basically means that you should be aware of the direction in which the rain garden will be viewed by those that see it. So if it's in your backyard and only you are seeing it, that is one thing. But if it's in your front yard, or if you have a corner lot and other people are going to see it, so keep that in mind. If you live in a community that maybe is more formal and everybody has their very perfect pristine lawn, then you might want to make sure that you have more a more defined looking space. So defined edges make a big deal, make a big difference. So a neatly edged bed, maybe there's some rocks on a border, bricks on a border, those kinds of things can make sure that it fits in with your neighborhood, so that maybe you have wild and crazy native plants that other people might be afraid of in there, but it's not setting off any alarm bells with your neighbors. You're going to consider the form and the texture of different plants. So some have thin and strappy leaves, some have light and feathery leaves. And putting a lot of things that are all the same together, it kind of just looks like a sea of green. But if you have all different kinds of textures, like in this picture we have here, we have these big flat leaves, and then behind it we have a much finer leaf. And so they look really nice next to each other. Color schemes. So, you look at what time things bloom, and see what things are blooming at the same time. Pick color schemes that you really like. How tall things are, how much they spread, all things you need to take into consideration, and seasonality. It's really best for any garden to have something going on throughout the whole year, whatever it is in the wintertime, it's a nice, pretty dead standing plant. Maybe it's a shrub that has berries or has interesting looking bark, so it provides fall, winter, early spring interest. I think that's a really important thing to consider living here in Northeast Ohio, because how many months of the year, I mean, nearly 6 months of the year, we don't have leaves and flowers. So important thing to keep in mind. And then as far as providing for wildlife, it's best to do things to have plants that bloom all throughout the growing season. So starting in late March, early April, all the way through October. You also may want to consider how many things you want to plant. So that's kind of a budget consideration. So some people like to overplant because they want it to look really good really soon. There's also less weeding if you overplant. But if you're a little bit more budget conscious, you may have to buy fewer plants and weed for a few more years until they fill in. So now for our planting layout. So the examples that you're going to see here are from Master Rain Gardener students from our online class that just finished up pretty recently. We actually have another one going on now, but our last one finished up about 6 weeks ago. For design plans, we recommend first drafting a base plan to show the location of your garden. So put that on graph paper, which is kind of what we have, which is kind of what you can see there. It shows it where you want to put your garden in relation to your water source, if there's any obstacles you might want to avoid. And then we ask the students to put a planting plan kind of over top of that with their plant choices and the design of their rain gardens. In this plan, you can see all the elements of our rain garden, where the water's coming from, that there's going to be a swale. You can also in our next photo, you're going to see how they put some plants in their garden. So here we have, there's a swale, that's how the water's getting into our rain garden, and then all of the plants that they've chosen to go in there. Something we do really recommend with planting design is considering everything's height, and then also clumping like things together. This is a consideration, one, for aesthetics, but also it makes weeding a heck of a lot easier. So if you have all these plants and you're not really familiar with what they look like when they're first coming up in the spring, you may weed out something that you really wanted because it was really a plant you wanted. But if you look at an area and you're like, there are 6 clumps of this coming up, this must be something that I planted, even though I'm not familiar with what it looks like this time of year. So notice in this one, they clumped all their nodding wild onions together and all their Canada anemones together. So it gives it a little bit more of a cohesive look, and it also helps you out with weeding in the future. So we spend a lot of time encouraging people to fill their rain gardens with native plants. So there's a few reasons why that is. One, a lot of our native plants are very well suited for the very specific conditions of a rain garden. So rain gardens, while they have a lot of water that gets into them at one time, they drain within 48 hours. And so something that drains within 48 hours, and then like we're kind of a little bit droughty right now outside, you may actually have to water the plants in your rain garden. So a lot of our native plants do really well with that periodic inundation with water, and then the subsequent drying and maybe being a little bit droughty. These native plants also have very deep roots, and that really helps the functioning of our rain garden. In this drawing here, you can see how deep all these native plant roots are. So for example, this one right here is Compost plant. And I mean, Compost plant can have roots that are 15 feet deep. So that's all these tiny little holes that are being poked in the soil that are then allowing for water to infiltrate into there. And as plants send out new roots and old ones die off, those old roots become organic matter in the soil that also helps with the soil's water holding capacity. So a lot of these native plants either have very deep roots or very fibrous roots, and both of those help with the infiltration of a rain garden. Another fun thing to point out on this picture is this is turf grass, the one that's all the way to the left. See how sad the roots on that turf grass is? It makes sense as to why a lot of times our lawns don't absorb very much water. They essentially function like green concrete. Native plants can also be a lot less maintenance too. So once they are established, because they're accustomed to our climate here, they're not like canna lily bulbs that you have to go and dig them up every fall. Once they're established, they're very low maintenance. And they also provide wildlife habitat. So our native animals, they're accustomed to eating our native plants. So in my rain garden, I get some of the coolest critters in there. I get all kinds of different butterflies, caterpillars and adults. I've gotten antlions, which are pretty cool. I get lacewings. So I get a lot of really, really, really cool animals and critters that live in my rain garden because these are the plants that they want to be eating. Good for bees, good for butterflies. So now we're going to go over some different native plants for different planting conditions. Most people have a little bit of a mix of sun and shade. Some plants deal with both of those conditions pretty well. And these are 3 really great these are kind of our bomb-proof examples. So blue flag iris is a great rain garden plant. It'll tolerate it very wet, but it does okay in the dry. Fox sedge is a really, really nice, it's not a grass, it's a sedge, but it definitely has a different look. Great blue lobelia is another really good one. So these will tolerate both sun and shade and will do great in just about any rain garden. Shade is one of our trickier conditions. So old recommendations like 20 years ago when they really just started talking about residential rain gardens, they said you couldn't put a rain garden in the shade. Well, they were wrong. You do have to plant it correctly with the right plants though. So here are three that are a really good choice for shade. So wild ginger loves the shade. If you put it in the sun, it will get very crispy and sad. It functions like a ground cover too. So if you want a really low maintenance rain garden, you put a shrub or two and some wild ginger in, and once that wild ginger spreads and fills in, you will have a very beautiful and very simple and easy to maintain rain garden. Ostrich fern. Ferns are great for rain gardens. We actually had somebody who did like 8 different species of fern in a rain garden, and it looked awesome. So ostrich fern in particular is one that spreads a little bit more quickly and it's really reliable. Wild hyacinth is like a beautiful kind of statement plant. This plant grows along rivers. So this is a riparian plant that grows along rivers. So it's used to that when the river floods and then it recedes. And it grows in these like forested areas. So in the springtime, it might get more sun, and around like now is actually when it's blooming. And then when the canopy fills in, it's fine. So also does great in the shade. So some plants are tolerant of part shade. So things like nodding wild onion, Canada anemone, and red osier dogwood, they'll all tolerate some shade. And then sun tolerant plants. I think we're all familiar with these. So switchgrass is a good one. It's not tall. There's like 40 different cultivars. You could find one in every height. You can get leaves that are more silvery, leaves that are more red, leaves that are more purple in the fall. It's a really, really great grass for your rain garden. Really for any garden. I would put it just about anywhere. Swamp rose mallow. It's our native hibiscus, and it has these big, beautiful tropical looking flowers. It grows in practically standing water, so it'll do great in a rain garden, even one with poorly draining soils. Blooms like mid to late summer. Really, really beautiful and stunning. There's lots of different cultivars of it if you want a different flower color or something like that. You see lots of bees and beetles in these, so they're great for our beneficial insects. And New England aster is one of our best fall pollinator plants. Here we can see it has a little skipper on it in this picture. And there are cultivars of New England aster that stay pretty short and neat too. So these all have like different options that can kind of make them fit your situation. So there are better times to plant than others. So let's say you got all your plants picked out and it's July. Should I wait to plant until fall? Or maybe just even put it off until the next spring, because spring and fall are the best times to plant? Or should I plant it in July? So if it was me and I knew that I had the time to pay attention to it, I might plant it just in the middle of summer and just water it constantly. Or I would wait until fall and plant it then. A lot of people forget about planting in the fall, but it's actually one of our best times to plant. The plants, they may not have their flower on them, they might not be showy when you're planting them, but they have that fall until the freeze in order to really get their root systems, to really put their energy into growing their roots. And that will be really good for surviving the winter. And then the next year they'll come back nice and robust. So we got everything in. We've planted, we've mulched, we've designed, we have a beautiful rain garden in our yard, but how do we take care of it? So we are going to want to water it. It might seem silly to water a rain garden, but we absolutely have to water it until our plants are established. So that usually can take about 2 years for them to be very well established, particularly during drought. You want to make sure that you're getting them well watered. You're going to want to weed it regularly too. So, and avoid those weeds if you don't get to them right away, but don't let them go to seed, because then you'll be fighting them for a long time. Like I said earlier, cluster those plants so that it makes it easier to weed too. You will have plants that don't do well, and it's okay. Just the hallmark of a good gardener is somebody who has killed a lot of plants because they have tried things and it hasn't worked. I kill plants all the time. And it's okay. You're not a failure. It was a learning experience. So replace those dead and dying things, and probably don't put the same thing in its place. Maybe try to find something else that would like it better. And then add mulch every year. You don't have to add a lot of it, and don't like way over mulch it, But a couple inches of double shredded hardwood mulch will nice will keep your plants happy. It'll help keep that moisture in and keep weeds away. And as that mulch breaks down, it also adds more organic matter to the soil, which is great. We do recommend the double shredded hardwood mulch because it doesn't float away. So these gardens are meant to hold water, collect water, and if you get like the big bark mulch, it will just float. And then if you have a big rain event and you have an overflow, all your mulch goes with it. So the double shredded actually locks together, kind of like puzzle pieces, and it actually will stay put in your rain garden, even during rain events. And here's another thing that we like to recommend for maintenance is leave your dead stems standing. Lots and lots of native bees and other insects use these dead standing stems to lay their eggs in. And it gives you something to look at in the winter. It can be beautiful. A winter garden can be beautiful. And in this area, you do need to consider that maybe pick things with very robust stems because snow will knock them down pretty quickly. And leave them standing, we say, until Mother's Day is kind of the rule of thumb for giving those native bees a chance to hatch out. If you must remove them, we do say remove them and like maybe put them somewhere to the side of your yard. Don't like burn them or put them in the compost or anything. Give those bees a chance to emerge. So we do get asked a lot of questions about rain gardens overall. So one, they say, is a rain garden a pond? And the answer is no. Rain gardens are saucer shaped, not bowl shaped. And they are supposed to dry out between rain events. In fact, if your rain garden is holding water for more than 48 hours, you probably need to redesign it. This rarely happens, and I don't think we've ever had a rain garden failure. We've had people who have had to tweak little things, but 48 hours, it shouldn't take longer than that to drain. And will they attract mosquitoes? They should not attract mosquitoes because mosquitoes require 7 to 12 days of standing water in order for them to lay their eggs and their eggs to hatch. So if it's dry after 48 hours, you are not going to have mosquitoes breeding in your rain garden. And do you need to fertilize it? If you planted your rain garden with native plants, you do not need to fertilize it. Our native plants actually do better if we don't fertilize them. So now you say, well, I am really interested in all of this, but this is a lot of information and it's really hard for me to digest. So this is why we created the Northeast Ohio Master Rain Gardener program, because we recognize that this is a lot to take in. There's a lot more that goes into building a rain garden than just, digging a hole and planting some plants. So we work with residents as well as landscapers to build that knowledge and skills to design, install, and maintain these rain gardens. And we do it over 5 weeks. So we put it in digestible chunks and kind of do a step-by-step process. You graduate this course with a plan in your hand. So this is what it looks like. Week 1, we go over stormwater management and rain gardens. 2, we work on sizing and siting of our rain gardens, so where and how big. During week 3, we plan the size of our garden. Since we already have the size and where it is, we plan our rain garden on paper. So that's when we draw in any obstacles, any things we want to avoid, where that water is coming from. Week 4, we go over designing and planting your rain garden. So week 4 is all about plants. I talk a lot in week 4. We talk about all different kinds of plants and design considerations. And in week 5, students get to present their own plans, and they get feedback from fellow students as well as instructors. And us instructors, we're available all along the way every week, because there is homework every week, to give you kind of feedback. And each class has plants of the day and stories of a rain garden. So you get to see regular folks, what their rain gardens were like, and the struggles and triumphs and tribulations that they had in installing their rain garden. And every week we give you a small digestible group of plants for a specific condition. Because that's one of the most intimidating things, is looking at a list of like 40 native plants and being like, where do I even start? And these classes are offered both in person and online. We offer 2 to 3 of each a year. We also offer this for professionals. So if you know somebody who is a landscaper or a landscape professional and they want to learn more about rain gardens, we do have a professional certification and we keep a list of them. So, or let's say you're like, this is great and all, but I don't want to do this myself. I want to pay someone to do it. You can contact Lake County Soil and Water Conservation District or Chagrin River Watershed Partners, and they can send you a list of people who have this certification. So they would do it right. We also have a community. So we've created this community of master rain gardeners. So we do have a Facebook group, and we will, this is where you post your homework so you can get feedback. Let's say you installed your rain garden 3 years ago and like you something new is happening, or you're tired of a certain plant, so you want to replace it and you want to fill everybody in. You can share all your stuff on here too. Instructors are very active on there too to answer questions. So what's left to do except for build your rain garden? So here we have, this is somebody from Washtenaw County, so in Michigan. So this is her journey through this program. So first, she chose her site. So you can see she took this class in winter. So she kind of paced out in the snow where it was going to be. Then she planned out with the plants that she was going to put in there and how the water was going to get to it. Then she planted it. And she got her sign. So when you finish this program, you do get a sign to install in your rain garden. We actually recommend that. We love it when people put these rain gardens in their front yards, because then they can educate their neighbors about rain gardens. And you also get a t-shirt when you finish. So we want you to market it for us. So here are some great Lake County and Northeast Ohio examples of folks that have installed rain gardens. So here we have Ray. He installed his last year. These lovely folks put theirs. They're very happy. They have some beautiful sunflowers growing along the edge of theirs. This is Meg. Meg is a mentor resident. Her rain garden looks like it's been at her house forever. She's also a master gardener, so that's probably one of the reasons why hers is so beautiful. Here's another Lake County resident who installed his. His is very simple, and it just collects the runoff from the roof of his gazebo. So it solved a problem, and it's beautiful. But let's say you cannot adopt a rain garden. You cannot build one yourself. Maybe you live in a condo. Maybe not everybody's yard is set up for it, but you really want to like become a master rain gardener. You can do that. You can adopt a rain garden. Lots of cities, parks, county, we have lots of rain gardens that need love and attention. And so you can adopt one, put a specific number of hours in renovating or taking care of that garden. And then you can get your certification that way as well. And we do have some classes that are coming up. So our next one starts in July, and that will actually hopefully be an in-person course, and that'll be held at the Holden Arboretum. And then in the late summer, Cuyahoga County Soil and Water Conservation District will be hosting an online course as well. So those are, you can kind of, you can watch the videos at your pace, and we do have a live question and answer every Friday on those. So they're not like a live in person, they are pre-recorded, but we do have a live component to them. So rain gardens lead to happy streams, happy wildlife, and happy people. And that's really all we want. That's really, really what we want here. So we are so happy that we have this program here in Northeast Ohio. So I see that I have a few questions. So is there a plant that helps remove or catch car oil or gasoline runoff from driveways or parked cars? So I don't know off the top of my head, but there are certain plants that do better in, like, for example, parking lot bioretention areas, which are a little bit more engineered than a residential one. But the plant choices are pretty specific. In general, the soil microbes do help break down petroleum products like runoff of drips and dribbles from your car. So a lot of that actually happens in the soil at like a microbial level. More of a concern being next to like roads, driveways, sidewalks is salt runoff. So we do recommend choosing salt tolerant plants. We actually have like a big spreadsheet that you can filter down that has all those criteria in it. Okay, so let's see. Our next question. Will hostas live 36 hours in standing water? I'm not sure. So there are different, a rain garden fortunately isn't all that super wet spot in the bottom of the basin. So hostas are not a native plant, so they don't really make our short list of like great plants to plant in your rain garden. But if it helps give it continuity with the rest of your landscape and make it fit in with your neighborhood, there's nothing wrong with putting hostas in your rain garden. I would plant them on the berm of your rain garden because it's the driest location, because I don't think they would like being wet for that long. And will this presentation be able to view again? I believe it is being recorded.
Yeah, so